This is a very late night session. I've been thinking about saying something for a few days now, but I've been distracted with other work. I've been translating Pneumatology, the Vladimir Shmakov book, which, is my next big book project. But what I really wanted to talk about, just off the top of my head really, because this is weighing on my mind a lot, and this is my generation, Generation X. And what's kind of brought this to my mind, well, this general principles I'm going to talk to you about is on my mind a lot, and a couple of things happened. One of them was I rewatched that brilliant film Spike Island about the Stone Roses concert up near in the north of England, because I grew up when the Stone Roses were big. I was going to clubs, acid parties, getting into warehouses, going off in convoys. I mean, generally, absolutely amazing time. So I rewatched Spike Island, which made me feel very nostalgic for those days. And I also listened to a Future Trend presentation that was for my day job. I listen to quite a lot of trend presentations, usually around design, but they also, because obviously design is informed by cultural trends, socio-economic patterns, what's happening in the wider world affects what people buy, how they shop, that sort of thing. It's often quite interesting for that reason. And I've seen a few of these trends lately because it's the time of year when retail is kind of buying stock and looking ahead to the future. And what was unusual this time is that of the two main trend series I listened to over the past, in this month actually, past few weeks, two of them, which were linked themes, really quite disturbed me. And they were both trends which really, I suppose, pertained largely to the generations coming up behind Gen X, my generation, which are, of course, millennials, and Gen Z. Gen Z being the youngsters who, youngest being, I suppose, younger than 10, but over the next decade, they'll be becoming, the young people of the future. And of course, millennials, they're already really becoming the prime group of earners, family builders, home builders. Now, what's really... Okay, so back to Spike Island. Generation X, I think, in my estimation, was part of the last great youth movement that I can think of in the Western world. And by youth movement, I mean a counterculture, a rebellion, a true rebellion against authority, or things that are perceived to be unjust about authority, an assertion of liberty, freedom of expression, a kind of libertarian impulse, I suppose. And in the 80s, we had a lot of great things going on. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989 at the end of the decade, which is also the summer of love in Britain. Great summer. Parties everywhere. There was a real spirit of love. And one of the great things about the acid house movement, a lot of people think it was just about drugs and music they might not like. But actually that era broke down a lot of barriers because yes, people did take a lot of drugs, which I'm not advocating, but one of the upsides at that time of a lot of people taking ecstasy and dancing together was it broke down a lot of racial barriers and racial tension, sexual, gender-based things, gay, straight, whatever you were. Actually, didn't even come into it a lot of the time. People were too busy dancing. But the point is that these barriers just broke down, which was important because at the tail end of the 70s there was football hooliganism in Britain. There was a lot of racism. So this movement really moved things along in a positive direction in so many ways. And in this respect, it, I suppose, had echoes with the 60s, where there was a bit the previous great countercultural movement. In some ways, perhaps you might say, a lot more serious if you look at the American expression of that counterculture, because, there was a draft. They were protesting the Vietnam War because college students, they weren't just worried about whether or not they could go partying, they were worried about whether or not they were going to get drafted into the army. And they also had segregation on a much worse scale. And then you had things like the Black Panthers and, trying to break down racial inequality on their side of the Atlantic and win some freedom, win the right not to go to war. You had, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Iran-Contra affair, the overthrow of President Kennedy. I do believe that was a political assassination. So lots of things that, plenty of reasons why there should be a really great countercultural youth-driven movement, which also was, again, asserting liberty and going against the grain of a corrupt establishment. Now, what disturbed me, going back to the trends, which kind of set off this thinking, is they were also talking about a youth movement going on today. And if you think about the sorts of things that the youth might be interested in, there's a lot of economic woes, that's for sure. So that comes into it, that this was sort of, there was a kind of nihilism that was driving a lot of this, to do with the economy and dissatisfaction with society and the way things are perceived and the way that authority is perceived. Matters to do with the environment, gender, identity. Now, okay, on the surface of it, you think, okay, so fine, just sounds like a replay in this decade of, what happened in the 80s and the 60s. However, what bothers me is that whilst in those previous eras we were really working against authority, now I feel that our younger generations are being exploited and totally manipulated, and that whilst they believe that they're rebelling against authority, they're actually being led all the way up the yellow brick road by them, they, the others, those in power, thoroughly corrupted. Really, I have to talk about it on a globalist scale, because this is where it's coming from. I don't think we've really got proper governments in countries anymore. I think we've got country admins, and that, we're just wrapped up in a matrix of globalist institutions, which, if you take the UN, it was founded on very good principles. It sprang out of the Rurik Pact, the Rurik Cultural Pact, signed by, almost 130 nations. You know, when with world wars on the horizon, where basically nations agreed that they weren't going to destroy each other's cultural heritage no matter how bad things got, so that what was best in those nations, whatever they were, would be preserved, and a pact was formed, and from this sprang the UN. But now the UN, I mean, you know, what comes to mind now when I think of the UN is a video taken from a street camera in some impoverished nation. I think it might have been South Africa or somewhere, where a UN car, and it was being filmed, and basically there was an official sat in the back with a prostitute and being filmed in a sexual act, and that to me just summed it up. You know, the stuff that's going on, you know, and then we've got the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, all these things, they sound like they should be good. The World Economic Forum, by the way, is a private corporation. It's not even an official, it's not even a supranational thing, like many people think it is, but so many of our leaders have gone through the World Economic Forum youth programme, you know, by Klaus Schwab, a man of very dubious background and ethics, and you know, basically the point is that all these institutions are just completely compromised. If, let's just remind ourselves, way back in the 60s, which is a long time ago now, a president can be overthrown. You had the Watergate scandal, the Iran-Contra, the Cuban Missile Crisis, what went on in the Cold War, and basically the intelligence agencies taking over in America. It's, why would people think that things have improved since then, when of course the leaves of control, those who are controlling nations in the world, they've just consolidated their power over that time, and they've wised up, because these cultural movements, now of course you can argue that even in the 60s there was an element of that youth movement being controlled, because LSD was manufactured by the CIA. There's credible evidence that Charles Manson, you know, that he was also had links that, you know, I'm not trying to get conspiratorial, but as you know, President Kennedy did talk about a conspiracy so dark and deep that it's barely comprehensible to most people. And you know, the upshot is that even if you don't think that the foxes are in charge of the hen house, it has to be acknowledged that the public only ever sees the absolute tip of the iceberg of what's going down sort of geopolitically, and the stuff that's happening behind the scenes. I don't think we could even fathom. I mean, we're at war right now. Almost 1 million people died already between Russia and Ukraine. Wouldn't surprise me. Certainly talking in the hundreds of thousands, weren't they? And anyway, back to my youth movements. I do believe that young people today are being incredibly manipulated, and I feel really concerned for them, because I don't think they have. I mean, when I was a teenager and in my 20s, we had some kind of freedom. Not just to go and dance in a field or somewhere where you weren't supposed to be, but the clubs, there was more freedom. There was more freedom in the air. And now there is nothing. It's all controlled. We weren't welded to technology. We weren't stuck on social media. People weren't glued to phones or devices like they are now. I mean, I see kids walking on the street and they're just like staring, not just kids by the way, but it bothers me most when I see young people, school children, staring at their phones. as they're walking, hunched over these phones. When I go walking, I look at the flowers, listen to the birds, I look at nature. I'm not trying to say that I'm so great, but that's what I want children to be looking at, not at their phones. And the way that they're being manipulated by social media and herded, that they are not free. And the thing is Generation X, I think we were the last generation that actually remembers what it was like to have some kind of freedom, because we weren't brought up with this technology. And people are being manipulated. They think that by supporting these gender issues and racial issues that they're doing something new in the environment, as if we hadn't already, us being the slightly older people that they probably despise as being fuddy-duddy now, it had already broken down so many barriers. And what I see happening now is those walls being put back up. And that rather than improving things for minority groups, we're actually just creating massive divisions in society and basically being gaslighted. And we are living in the age of deception. I won't talk about the things that have happened too much in the past few years and the things that are going on now, which constitute a deception and living a lie and being told lies, taught lies, and being threatened with arrest if you don't think and speak and act upon these lies. And the youth being completely bamboozled by this. Not all of them. I mean, if they're smart and well brought up and have strong-minded parents and are strong-minded themselves, then maybe they can resist this, I don't even know what to call it. It seems to be quite Bolshevik to me in its essence, and that's not meant to be a comment about Russia. It just is the best term I can think of right now for what I think is happening. And, the people being drawn away from God and the divine into the machine. And Rudolf Steiner, he talked about the web that would wrap itself around the world in some of his discussions about the eighth sphere and how it would suck in souls. And, if that wasn't a metaphor for what's happening technologically and the technocratic takeover of society, which is happening, let's just make no bones about it, it is happening. We're all in it now. So we're not just sleepwalking towards war, we're sleepwalking towards the eighth sphere if we're not careful, if we can't maintain our personal integrity. And I really do wonder what's on the horizon and how fast it's going to come. And this is just a kind of shout out, really, to anyone of any generation who's listening, who thinks that things are not as they should be, and they wonder what on earth's going on. Well, you're not alone. And there is a resistance, not just political or social, also spiritual. And I suppose the point of this is to say, let's stick together, because united we will stand, and it's the divide and conquer that we want to reject. United before God, together in our integrity as sovereign, free human souls, human spirits, free minds, free bodies, free souls, with Christ consciousness. This is what I hope for us.